myself. I'm Lisa Ryers. I'm one of the co-presidents of the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco, and I'm class of 1990. And again, we're encouraging everyone to go ahead and rename themselves with their year of graduation if you attended Brown. And I also just want to remind everyone that we are recording the event today. And I'm really just so grateful for everyone's participation today. At this point, when Zoom fatigue is so high, to have everyone just share their Sunday in the two-dimensional space with us again. I think you'll find it really a great trade-off for what you're about to hear today, however. So today, I'm really delighted to welcome our 2021 Pulitzer Prize winner in history, oh, hi, Andrea.
Hi.
Marcia Chatelain, who received her master's from Brown in 2003 and her Ph.D. from Brown in 2008. And she's joining us to discuss franchise, which takes us from the first McDonald's drive-in in San Bernardino in the 1940s to civil rights protests at franchises in American South in the 1960s, and the McDonald's on Florissant Avenue in Ferguson in the summer of 2014, among other places. Chatelain charts how the fight for racial justice is intertwined with the fate of Black businesses. Marcia Chatelain is professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University and is a leading public voice on the history of race, education, and food culture. Welcome, Professor Chatelain. And sharing footsteps through Brown's American Studies AmCiv department, Dr. Chatelain will be interviewed by Julia Mickenberg, class of 1990. Julia L. Mickenberg is professor of American Studies and affiliate faculty in the Center for Women and Gender Studies, the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies, and the Center for Russian and Eastern European and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She received her A.B. from Brown in 1990 with a degree in AmCiv and a Ph.D. in American Studies and minor in Feminist Studies from the University of Minnesota. So welcome you both. I'm going to pass it over to Julia and ask that everyone stay muted for the first 20 minutes or so during this Q&A between our two professors, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone. So welcome, everyone.
Hello. I'm really honored to be here, and I have promised Lisa that I would stop asking questions after about 20 minutes, but I have a ton of questions to ask. So if there is not enough discussion from the group, I'm happy to ask enough to get Marcia to talk a lot about the book. I was coached that I'm supposed to ask something relating to the wonderful Brown training that influenced your scholarly chops and creativity and all that. So I'll start with that so I don't forget. You know, I'm so struck by your both your writing, which is beautiful and so engaging, but also your methods of historical and cultural analysis, which include granular attention to local history, informed by interviews, in-depth research, like all over the place, and attention to particular contexts informed by this wide and deep engagement with scholarship in a range of fields. You draw on all this material that informs your analysis, but you also build on work that has sort of not, that has informed one piece of your analysis, but has not thought to draw the set of connections that you have, that you do. So for example, in one footnote, you say, the research and scholarship on food justice, health equity, and the fast food industry is vast, but even texts that have gained a lot of attention often fail to take on how race and history intersect with their concerns. And then you bring this scholarship into conversation with work on civil rights, Black power, and especially Black capitalism. And in so doing, you repeatedly come to striking new insights. And since you got your PhD at Brown, I assume your training was a little more recent, and maybe you have a better memory of those years. I'm getting pretty old, but is it possible for you to reflect on how your graduate training at Brown may have, shaped your approach to American studies, American history, and African American studies? And then I promise I'll focus on the book.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to the club for hosting this event. In the before times, now I can't remember what year it was. Maybe it was before the election, which is how it's the election and COVID is how I date everything. So it must have been in 2015. I had the opportunity to join the folks in the club for a conversation, and then we all went out. It was so fun. But anyway, all of this is to say that, my time at Brown was so important because I had actually majored in journalism as an undergraduate. And so my approach to writing was to think of, articles, perhaps a little bit of long form magazine writing as kind of a self-contained entity, right? You have X thousand words to unfold everything to peel the onion, the metaphor they used to use in journalism training, and that was it. And then you move on to the next thing. And I was really bad at that. I really wanted to tell longer, fuller stories, and I wanted to linger on the details. And so what attracted me to Brown American Civilization, as it was named at the time, was that it was a graduate program I could actually get into with this really kind of disparate training in magazine journalism and another undergraduate degree in religious studies. And so Brown kind of saw the ways that I was thinking about history and culture and sociology and all of these different fields. And there's a real understanding that interdisciplinarity was something of value. Even though I teach in a history department now, I wouldn't have gotten into a history PhD program when I really think about it. But I think what worked was the fact that that training was all about kind of thinking about not only the literature of different fields, but to think about what is missing when we only ground ourselves in one disciplinary position. And so in all of these years in working on this book, the reason why I wanted to write it was because, in the early 2000s, when the movie Super Size Me came out, when people were reading Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, and they're reading Michael Pollan, there was all of this, these discourses about fast food that when it was boiled down to people eating fast food, there was always a narrative about race and a narrative about community that I felt like erased history and culture in ways that could actually be helpful and productive. And so my years at Brown were so special. I mean, it's like I went to college again. I was super young when I started my PhD program, to a point where I think I would have been a better scholar had I done other things first. But, I started when I was 22, maybe, and I had only worked for 1 year out of college. And in many ways, Brown was like going to another undergraduate experience, not only because of my age, but because I had to be oriented into a different type of inquiry, small classes, seminars. I went to a large public university where those things weren't really possible. And so, I credit a lot of the stirrings that gave me the confidence to try to do this weird book about McDonald's and Black freedom struggles from Brown, because it wasn't just the kind of scholarship that was being done in the department, it was the types of speakers we would get on campus. I remember Eric Lott, who wrote about the history of blackface minstrelsy in the United States, giving a paper about the film Candyman, and it was so good. And it was about urban planning and ideas about space, and just being in an intellectual environment where this is the type of research where people are really excited to engage in really made me more creative as a scholar.
Well, thank you. And it really resonated. The book really resonated with me as somebody who remains in American Studies program, and the excitement of that. If you don't mind, I want to read a little passage from your epilogue I could ask you to read it, but I'll just read it since I have it open. But I think that it, I know that I invited some people to come and I said, you don't have to read the book. So I think it gives a good kind of overview of the book for people who haven't read it. And then I'll jump into a question based on it, but it really gives a taste of what you're addressing. This book is concerned with the reasons that places like Ferguson are more likely to get a fast food restaurant rather than direct cash aid to the poor, oversight over the police department, or jobs that pay more than $8.60 per hour after an uprising. The story also explains how fast food became Black and why it came to mean so many things to Black communities. In order to fully appreciate the origins of our contemporary health crisis, we cannot fixate solely on the food. We have to tell stories about the many functions of capitalism and its ability to satisfy some of our most personal needs while starving our collective present and future. Government support for fast food franchising has imperiled Black health, but our societal vigilance should take us beyond that. In addition to government assistance, the fast food industry relies on indefinable but palpable emotional appeals to Black consumer citizenship, the extension of the mid-century march for civil rights toward the marketplace, and calls for racial solidarity under the expansive umbrellas of Black capitalism and later Black empowerment. The origins of the urban food crisis reveal the ways that various actors, politicians, civil rights activists, business executives, advertising agencies, community organizers, and market researchers, and I'll tell you, Marcia writes about all of these different groups in the book, aligned to use the symbols, language, and strategies of Black freedom movements to sell scores of hamburgers, myriad buckets of fried chicken, and gallons of soda. Studying the hidden history of how fast food and civil rights aligned to change Black America and the ways that Black America changed fast food can lead to more nuanced understandings of our concern about ensuring that communities that have the least receive the most support to create choices for themselves and for future generations. And I'll just read one bit more. A public that decries fast food as a matter of bad choices is a public that is ignorant to the fact that the meeting of racism and capitalism can only produce demeaning and uncomfortable options. In the ongoing yet still superficial public conversation about fast food, race, and health, we have to remember that our catastrophic disparities are a result of a structural indifference to the depth of Black hunger for everything from nutritious foods to well-compensated jobs to racial justice. So awesome, so well put. And so my question is, you begin and end with the events at Ferguson, and this is a racial uprising that most readers will be familiar with. And you talk about the ways that McDonald played a role there. On the one hand, it was the site of arrests and vandalism. On the other hand, in the recap of what happened in the St. Louis excerpt, the Florissant McDonald's was portrayed as a bright spot and an anchor for the community. And you told almost the exact same story or a variation on the same story about what happened after the LA riots. So this story kind of becomes paradigmatic for the rest of the book as you discuss many less well-known or well-remembered sites of resistance and reconciliation that involve McDonald's, especially Black-owned McDonald's franchises and members of the Black community in Philadelphia, Portland, Cleveland, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and elsewhere. And I wonder if you can talk about your process of discovering and researching these sites, and how did you determine, which places and stories to include in the book? Because you really, there's just wonderful attention to narrative and storytelling and even characters.
Well, when you have a book that gets like good attention, everyone's like, what's your next book? What are you going to do next? And I remember a piece of advice a colleague gave me, and I think it's so true about, your book is not just a reflection of your intellectual ideas and growth, it's also a reflection of where your life is. And so the book that became, my first book was for my dissertation at Brown, into my early career. And there was a level of attention I could give my research at that phase of my life. But it was all about kind of covering my bases, acknowledging the scholar, not going, not stepping too deep into these conversations because you don't feel like you have a right to. And a second book, in some ways, you get more confident and less confident all at the same time because the stakes seem higher. Have I grown up from my first book? Am I a better researcher? And I will say that this book, what I'm proud of about Franchise is the fact that I was so relentless in the pursuit of archive, because McDonald's has an internal corporate archive that is not open to the public, or at least was not open to me. And so when I heard like, okay, we have all these documents that you're not going to have access to, I started to get really committed to saying, okay, the whole point of this book is to change the lens, to tell a different story about fast food in America. And so if I put African-American communities at the center of it, what can I find? And it was unbelievable, the volume of material about McDonald's as they interacted with groups like the NAACP to try to broker community relations, as McDonald's franchise owners were contributing to groups like the United Negro College Fund, as groups like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was protesting and boycotting McDonald's in Portland. Operation Black Unity in Cleveland has a bone to pick with McDonald's. And then you have people like Julian Bond, the late congressman from Georgia. He is very pro-Black business and he's very pro-franchising. And his documents have all sorts of things about McDonald's. And he, franchises a Dairy Queen. There is this moment roughly between 68 and 88 where African-American political organizations have to rebuild financially. Some of them are being sued by the very groups that they protested throughout the 50s and 60s. They're losing membership because the appeal of legacy membership groups isn't the same. And so they are partnering with big fast food and a number of corporations. And so the archive is there. There are tons of things about McDonald's, and not just external paperwork, about how to apply for a franchise. What are the rules? What are the specifications for when they make donations? All of this stuff is available, but you have to take very seriously, which I was trying to do with this book, the fact that race will impact how corporations show up in communities. And once you understand that, the materials are there. And, I think for me, I saw McDonald's everywhere. I see it everywhere I go. Every time I'm looking at who sponsored this, the pool at the Aquatic Center at the University of Southern California, which was opened through for the '84 Olympics, which was paid for by McDonald's franchises. Every time I look at ephemera for kids, I'm thinking this could have been a McDonald's toy. And so I don't know if I'll ever write a book like this again, like heaven help me. The number of trips to Portland from the East Coast to track down 4 pieces of paper, the number of times going to San Bernardino to the unofficial McDonald's museum and telling, the guy who runs it, you really have to fireproof and waterproof this building. The number of trips to Atlanta to the, I went everywhere for this book because I felt like there were so many stories of communities that had these incredible interactions with McDonald's that I thought, there's so much here. And the real goal for me as a historian and as a scholar is for, a graduate student to read this in a seminar, maybe at Brown, and say, this book's not that good. Let me try to do a better job at looking at some of these connections, because it opens up the possibilities of a different way of imagining corporate history.
Well, I could see all the research, and then it just really, I'm also really addicted to research, and the idea that it comes together so seamlessly is really impressive, because it was a lot that you pulled together. To really get at the meat of what you're arguing, I want to just bring up a few things, and I don't know how easy it is to kind of tease these out. But on the one hand, you talk about the sort of intersections between the civil rights movement, or even maybe more precisely Black power, and the rise of fast food, the role played by the federal government, and then this thing, Black capitalism, which, as you point out, should have made a lot of people nervous in the era of Black power. And yet, because it was called Black capitalism instead of Black power, it seemed to be, very all-American, even though Black power was really about Black empowerment, which was a reason why civil rights people, many of whom were ostensibly anti-capitalist, could embrace Black power, or else be, or maybe their legacy, such as Martin Luther King's, could be pulled into supporting Black capitalism. But I want you to talk more about your critique of Black capitalism, and because it's so good, it's so powerful. And I also wonder if you've, just because I'm interested, you take on these huge corporations. Have you had any pushback? Because it's a really brave book.
Yeah, it's funny. So I think that there's often a misunderstanding about what I'm writing about. And I think some of it is being a woman, because, sometimes people say, oh, you're the person who wrote that book about all the great things McDonald's did in Black communities. I said, and it'll be someone who actually read the book. And I'm like, really? Is that what you took away from the book? Or, so people say, well, is this a takedown book of McDonald's? And when I say no, I said, this is an indictment of a way that we have responded to racial injustice. That I think it was one thing when the book came out in January 2020, where people were like, oh, this is kind of a novel way of thinking about the relationship between civil rights and fast food. But from the vantage point of the summer of 2020, the George Floyd summer, when you have this incredible moment of Black political resistance, and you see the corporations doing their thoughts and prayers comments, McDonald's tweeting Black Lives Matter, like, what are we talking about? I had moved into a new house in the last fall, and I was, trying to order furniture, and I would go on the websites of like Crate and Barrel or West Elm, and they would say, Crate and Barrel cares about Black lives. 15% of our furniture designers will be African American. And I'm like, not the point. Like, great, but not the point at all. But this is some dangerous logics that this period really brought into focus. That you think about after the assassination of Martin Luther King, people are entrenched in the failures of federal policy for any kind of racial justice. You have Black unemployment in some cities, youth unemployment at 50% or higher. You have no fair housing provisions. You have no movement on schools. King's final campaign of open housing in Chicago is a disaster. So you have all of these like real problems. And then you have the total exhaustion of people who were trying to shepherd in a new world order. And it would be easy for me to say it was a cynical embrace of capitalism because nothing else was working. But if you think about the terms of Black capitalism, to suggest that more ownership of Black businesses will yield this kind of great opportunity for community sustenance, it's a very seductive premise. And it's not because people were evil or because they were bad or because they were ignorant. It's because in our system today, it's just a set of constrained choices to deliver something. And what I wanted this book to really think about is, if we are really concerned about the quality of people's health, then we have to think about the way that the fast food industry was presented as a viable economic and social possibility for people who are asking for racial justice. It's such a upside down logic, but it has become integrated in our way that we respond to racial injustice, that in 2020, it makes sense that, my furniture store is committing to Black lives when that wasn't the request. Because if you think about the origins of these moments of racial unrest, they usually involve racist violence, and especially they usually involve police violence. And nothing that is put forward as solutions actually answers the question that people have presented. And so, I think I initially set out to maybe tell a novel story about, isn't it weird that access to Black franchising of McDonald's opened up right after King's assassination? And when I took a step back, I said, oh, these are the logics of an abandonment of even the possibility of civil rights being real in people's lives. And this was the compromise. And it went in all of these directions, but it's something that I think we all have to kind of sit in the discomfort of us imagining that what we think of as access and opportunity is not actually justice. And making that really clear, I think, can prevent us from making the same mistake next time that we find ourselves really ensnared in a moment of reckoning.
I guess just to push you a little more on that issue, I mean, you call the book Franchise, and part of the point is that when somebody opens up a McDonald's franchise, when an African American opens up a McDonald's franchise, it's not really a Black-owned business. I mean, it is a Black-owned business, but a huge proportion of the profits go to the McDonald's Corporation, not to that Black business. And then, even though you do make the point that these Black franchise owners do give tons to their communities, they make a huge difference in their communities, and that is part of the reason, that and massive marketing campaign targeting Black communities, and federal dollars that make it possible for these Black franchisees to open McDonald's. That's part of the reason that those are there, and that there's loyalty and support in Black communities, but it's not the same as a 100% Black owned business that is able to invest a huge proportion of its profits back into the community. Do you think that actual Black owned businesses offer more of a solution, or can I push you harder on that critique of Black capitalism?
Well, I think that this is one of the most dangerous and ideas in all of this. Most Black-owned businesses in the United States, more than 90% of them do not employ a single person, right? They have the sole proprietor and maybe one employee. This is not a viable solution of having businesses as an engine of employment, of even kind of broadening tax bases in order to fulfill the gaps of long-term neglect. This is such a dangerous idea. It's along the lines, and this is a San Francisco crowd, so you'll appreciate this. This idea that that tech is the future, but having the skills for tech isn't a matter of taking like one course online. Sometimes there's a narrative that says, well, we can just get a lot of young people in tech. Maybe they can do a high school equivalency, and then everyone is coding and programming. It doesn't quite work like that. And it doesn't mean that these are not possibilities for individual economic mobility, but this is not a solution. More Black-owned businesses does not actually address any of the problems created by racial capitalism. And so I'm very, very clear that I do not support government subsidies to create more Black-owned businesses, not because I don't think that they are an important part of communities or they're an important feature that harkens back to important historical moments. It's just they will never do the things that they are implicitly tasked with by being in the community. This is one of the greatest setups for failure and one of the greatest smoke screens for real accountability. And so, people say, well, what, sometimes I get asked, like, what can be done? And I said, well, all of the time and money and effort that McDonald's puts into lobbying to suppress the federal wage, free that up and start paying people more. If you pay people more, give them paid sick leave, give them free college and free childcare, we are on a more steady route to the fulfillment of all these ideas of racial justice than to suggest that a Black-owned dry cleaners in a community will make any difference. And people learn this after the Watts uprising. They learned this after this moment in '68. We learned it in 1992 in Los Angeles, and then we completely forget it. We don't invite any historians to the conversation, and then we come up with new startup capital. This is infuriating to me and it's insulting. And I understand why it happens. I understand why people say, look, in the presence of nothing, right, that's being offered, this might be our greatest hope. I get it 100%, but we have to be very clear of what we can actually deliver when we use these market-based, federally subsidized approaches to Black wealth. It's like, that's not the issue. We're talking about the basics of survival and a life with dignity. So it makes me so grumpy, and I get why it happens. And so, I really want my book to sound the alarms. I don't know how effective it is in that, but it's trying its hardest to just say, wait, let's just take a minute and really think about what we're suggesting that can happen or what we can provide.
I think it is really effective, but it's also really balanced, and that's what I admire about it. So that you don't come out saying, McDonald's is the ultimate evil. McDonald's is a corporation, and it behaves like a corporation. And I may use this book in I teach a cultural history class, and I have in the past taught Fast Food Nation, and that book was getting a little bit dated. And I thought, oh, this is doing all that. And I have more questions, but I said that I would open it up to questions. So I'm going to curb my enthusiasm for a moment and see if anyone would like to jump in with questions, and then I'll keep asking if there's not enough. If people have a question, you can go to the little reaction thing on the bottom and raise a hand.
And in the meantime, I'm going to actually share my screen real quick. Show just, this is actually for me, and I've always felt this way about anything I write. There's also a visual story that needs to be told. And if you haven't seen the cover of the book, this is everything that you need to know. Someone being sworn in to take the oath of voting at a McDonald's. And this is a picture from Portland, Oregon. And this McDonald's was the scene of a confrontation between the Black Panther Party and the McDonald's franchise owner, because they wouldn't participate in the free breakfast program for children. And so I think, that double meaning of, marching towards the right to vote and it becoming about an access to a McDonald's franchise is something that is so perfectly captured in this picture. And the editor for this book, Katie Adams, came up with the title. I had a lot of bad titles before she chose this one.
Did you looks like you have a few more images you wanted to show us.
Sure. It's this is probably, this is the image that I evoke at the very beginning of the book. And what's so powerful about it is this type of moment of kind of, racial uprising and unrest. It is the story of McDonald's. And so this image from 2014 for me was so evocative of these images from 1968. And the story really does unfold after King's assassination in Memphis. And McDonald's had kind of thought about bringing African Americans into the fold of franchising. But what really brings them in is that, like our George Floyd summer last summer, these questions of reckoning. What can institutions do? What do college and universities need to do? What do the foundations need to do? And the Nixon administration was very keen on implementing programs in Black capitalism, because there was a sense that if there was a focus on Black entrepreneurship and enterprise, there would be less pressure on some of the really complicated issues like fair housing, like school integration. And so there's this kind of nefarious way that Nixon is able to, make a gesture towards the few Black Republicans who are still active in the party, as well as to say, I can provide something of substance. The other thing that is fascinating as someone who grew up in Chicago is seeing this plaque on a McDonald's for years and trying to really understand, what does it mean for this McDonald's to be christened as the first Black owned and operated one? And the fact that it is opened 8 months and a few weeks after King's assassination is also not a coincidence. This location, like some of the other locations I write about in the book, are abandoned by white franchise owners. They no longer want to do business in Black communities. And McDonald's facilitates that transfer. And throughout the book, there's this kind of eerie parallel between the ways that people talk about franchising and the things that we know about racial discrimination in housing, right? People don't want a Black franchisee moving into predominantly white franchise areas. There's all sorts of acts of intimidation and threats and bombings and all of these different types of mechanisms of racial intimidation, while locations are really grappling with the consequences of white flight that isn't just about housing and revenue from taxes for education, for schools, but it's also about the loss of businesses and the loss of jobs from white-owned small businesses that are no longer operating in cities like Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles. And then there's all sorts of, a veneration of the Black franchise owner by the Black press, where stories like this populate the kind of story. There's a story of, the FBI surveilling Black protesters outside of McDonald's. And then the last thing I'll say, this is Bill Clinton also eating McDonald's, is that there is a way in which McDonald's advertises to Black consumers that has little to do or nothing to do with food, rather, but about its impact through its Black franchise owners, its contributions to the United Negro College Fund, the fact that they're the largest employer in the 1980s of Black youth in America. And so when McDonald's becomes something other than just a place to buy a burger, you start to see the real challenges that come in the 90s and the early 2000s to disrupt the consumer behaviors and say, well, you shouldn't eat McDonald's. And it's like, well, McDonald's is more than this. McDonald's is part of the community. So I'll stop the share there. But, one of the things I really enjoyed with this book is it's so visually captivating, because there's so much in terms of the advertisements throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s. I went to New York to the Paley collection, which is an archive of moving images, and watched McDonald's commercials all afternoon. I was crying by midday, because it's so evocative and it's so emotionally powerful. So these advertisers make millions of dollars because it's really effective. It works on all of us.
Yeah, and I see we do have a question. I'm going to ask it, but on the advertising, I was struck that they, was this Black marketing agency that really pioneered the advertising. And so it's, it was the opportunity that it provided for this Black agency, but promote again, yeah. But John Tupin.
Hi, I'm his wife, Anne. I'm here with my daughter, Chantal, who also went to Brown, and my sister, Janique. And we really appreciated the book. And this is such a rare experience to get to meet with you like this. So thank you for that. The question I had was about the event you talked about in Atlanta, where there was this failed Dairy Queen enterprise. And I wondered if you had any reflection or lessons learned from what these three kind of co-investors, Black and white, tried to do, and why it failed, or what people might think about going forward.
Yeah, I love this story because, again, this franchise moment, it wasn't just kind of popular among African Americans. It was, people really believed that the franchise model was going to make every American a millionaire. I'm trying to think of if we have an equivalent now. I guess it would be the ways that, everyone thinks they can be a social media influencer, or, Twitter famous. People were really excited about franchising because it had relative low entry point, and you didn't have to go to college, and you didn't have to have a master's in business, and you could become really successful. So McDonald's is setting this environment because they're the first publicly traded fast food company, and people are making so much money from McDonald's. It's just, it's blowing everyone away. Everyone wants a piece of the action. And so this Dairy Queen, it's two Dairy Queen restaurants that are franchised by Hank Thomas Julian Bond and who are African-American, and Gerald Reed, who's a white dentist, and they're all involved in civil rights. Julian Bond and Hank Thomas are arrested in the freedom rides. I mean, this is like real serious stuff. So they decided they're going to kind of get into Dairy Queen franchising, and it's a disaster. I mean, someone needs to write an entire book about this Dairy Queen, because the financial documents in Julian Bond's archive at the University of Virginia is just amazing. I mean, it's everything that, it's the reason why you're not supposed to start a business with your friend. It's, you know, hurt feelings. You owe me $7,000. I mean, this really wipes Julian Bond out. And so essentially what they say that the issue is, the reason why it failed was because they opened near Morehouse College, and it was exposed as not a real Black business. And they said that they were targeted by student groups, and they were, you know, that there was a sense that there was a paternalistic kind of feeling of this white dentist and these two Black people trying to open this business and saying it was Black owned. And this idea of authenticity, who's lying and who's really telling the truth, becomes a preoccupation in the 1970s. One, because a lot of white business owners are trying to capitalize on the Black capitalism trend and getting kind of these businesses that are not really Black owned, but in the background, they're white people kind of pulling the strings. And so people are really vigilant about it. But it was this idea that you could provide this as a model of what's possible. And when there's resistance to it, it really hurts Gerald Reed financially. I think it essentially bankrupts him because there's so much capital put into this. Julian Bond is at odds, and Hank Thomas is the one who kind of learns from this mistake, and he becomes one of the largest franchise owners of McDonald's in the South. And recently he switched into franchising hotels. And so each of them kind of represent the moment where there is suspicion of white allyship, and there's a real sense of kind of loss, that there was a time where an interracial beloved community approach to civil rights could have worked. Julian Bond is realizing that he had no business investing in this. And then he later, he continues to be a real proponent of Black capitalism and entrepreneurship, but he just says that he's not good at it. And Hank Thomas takes a step back, and he still has a vision of Black ownership that will work for him throughout the South. So they kind of take different paths, but the obsession with kind of who's really making money off of this really lingers. And there's a story in the book, for those of you who haven't read it, about Muhammad Ali and Mahalia Jackson, the gospel music singer. They create their own fast food chains. And their argument is these are actually authentically Black-owned businesses. What McDonald's is doing is really a bait and switch. They're not really Black-owned, we're really Black-owned. And when both of these companies collapse, you learn that they are not Black-owned, that both of these celebrities have leased their images and the right to use their name to white-owned companies. And celebrities were doing this a lot in the 70s. Joe Namath had the roast beef restaurant. Tennessee Ernie Ford, who's a football player, he lent his name. Sammy Davis Jr. had one. James Brown has one. James Brown actually tells the public in 1969 that he's no longer going to make music so he can focus on his franchise. It's all bananas. I mean, everyone is, you know, grifting at this point. But I think the thing that is really powerful is that it's not just about ideas about racial progress. There's something so fundamentally American that if you just follow this playbook, you will become as successful as, you know, Ray Kroc and McDonald's. And it is so not true. And, you know, I just finished watching that LuLaRoe documentary about the multi-level marketing and the leggings. And a lot of it reminds me of the materials that were given to people to say, you know, open a franchise, your whole family can do this. This is so easy. There's nothing harder. I'm sure there's like a restaurant owner in this chat or something. There's nothing harder than owning a restaurant. It's really, really hard. And so, you know, you see the kind of cracks in the system, but this is very seductive. And I think it continues today.
Yeah, I want to make sure that I get you to talk about food, so I will come back to it. But Mason has a question here.
Yes, hi, I hope you can hear me. So I was at a point like thinking to myself, as I read the book. I wonder if you're going to talk about Magic Johnson and his entrepreneurship with, putting Starbucks and movie theaters into African-American communities, and whether you think that's another case of really he wasn't the owner of this, but also looking at something like what LeBron James and Rich Paul are now doing, which is more on the cultural level, that they're trying to produce content, movies, some like Space Jam, which are just fluff, but also something like Survivor's Remorse, which is a little bit more of a story about African Americans and so forth. Okay, thanks. A great book, by the way.
Thank you. Magic Johnson, it's in the footnotes, but I don't know if I say it in the text. This is one of the first things that when I was a TA for Ethnic Studies 15, Professor Matt Garcia did a lecture about gentrification. There was a movie called Flag Wars, I think about Cincinnati. And we were talking, and I think I did my presentation on Magic Johnson Enterprises. So Magic Johnson got the right to put his name on a Starbucks, Chili's, and one of the movie theaters, one of the movie theater chains. I can't think of the name of it.
I think it was Century. Anyway, doesn't matter.
So he got the right to do them in Inglewood, California, I believe South Los Angeles, and in Harlem. Magic Johnson is no longer invested in any of these businesses. And this is actually something that in the Journal on Southern California History Boom, someone writes a very good analysis of he comes up with these big partnerships and then he's done. And what happens is you can sell those businesses back to the corporate entity. Starbucks isn't really franchise. Movie theaters are sometimes franchised. And then Applebee's, Chili's, these restaurants are often franchised. And so, but putting the Magic Johnson name on it gave people the impression that Magic Johnson owned them. And this has been a strategy that we see a little bit in the book, but again, came out of the LA uprising, right? Well, who's going to lead the economic development? Who's going to do the rebuilding of these places? And the Harlem Empowerment Zone that brought in these Magic Johnson enterprises, they were paying very low wages for the neighborhood. And so again, you see a version of it, and it's less risky for Magic Johnson because I don't think there is a series of a capital investment than if he did like a lot of African-American athletes now do, is they'll franchise 20 of 20 Del Tacos, or I have 10 McDonald's on my portfolio and 10 Smoothie Kings. But franchises were able to expand so rapidly in the 90s because African Americans who had a lot of access to wealth would get blocks of them and put it as part of their larger portfolio. The reason why this is challenging is that people who were cashing out their retirements to try to get into franchising for the first time, they couldn't keep up with the pace of store acquisition as some of these people who were more capitalized. So it's this really interesting thing that has happened over this past year where there's more than 50 Black franchise owners who are suing McDonald's right now. And they're making all of the claims that I make in the book that people were upset about in the late 60s and early 70s. They're being redlined only into Black neighborhoods. They're not getting the resources of McDonald's. And the other thing, and now that this is like my whole life, this is all I see. I don't really eat fast food that often, but if I go, my husband still enjoys Taco Bell and a McFlurry now and then. If we go through the drive-through, I look at the menu, and anytime I see a fast food menu with tons of ingredients, I think to myself, how do you make any money? Because the overhead to stock, when McDonald's went to all-day breakfast, this really hurt a lot of franchise owners, right? And so there's this really kind of strange cycle that McDonald's goes through with conflicts with Black franchise owners. This time, it's the most public it's ever been, where people who actually have franchises are, criticizing McDonald's, people who are differently situated, and it was because of COVID. People were really struggling because of COVID.
I don't see another hand, so I'll jump in quickly before one comes up and ask a question, because this book is also about food and health.
Yes.
The obesity epidemic, the health issues plaguing poor and Black communities, and this assumption that, quote, people of color have a natural affinity for fast food, unquote. So this book attempts to get to the root of these issues and assumptions, asking, and I quote again, what are the everyday choices and circumstances for Black Americans? Why is fried carryout so easy to get? Why is fresh produce a rarity? What failures have created cities with few safe places to play and exercise? And I wonder if you could talk more about, how food justice is part of your story. And also, I was curious about, near the end of the book, you mentioned this new business, Local, it was not even trying to make a profit, but was trying to serve the community, and was not successful in challenging the predominance of fast food. You do mention something about the ways in which school lunches kind of shape kids' palates. But I wonder if you could just talk more about the food piece of this. And, other people certainly have written about the food parts of it. And I can see that's why you didn't maybe spend so much time in there, because there was a lot of other stuff. But I'm wondering what thoughts you have.
Yeah, I think I probably started out, I started thinking about this book when I was at Brown, before I even published my first book. Like, my fascination with this issue goes way back, but I didn't know where to situate it, because on one hand, there's nothing kind of like natural about liking any kind of commercialized food product. We have to be introduced into it and kind of socialized into it. And so the thing that I thought was really interesting was this idea that people who eat fast food aren't discerning, because I think fast food is an incredibly practical choice depending on the circumstances you're in, right? You've been driving a really long distance, you need to stay awake, you need more sustenance. Fast food makes a lot of sense. Carbohydrates, fats, sugar, it's going to get you to the next thing. If you work multiple jobs, eating something that's cost $6 that you can eat like in 3 minutes makes perfect sense. So there are some logics to fast food that I think we have to acknowledge. But I think the food justice part of it is really about not about imagining kind of a world in which choices are not so heavily weighted because people actually have choices. And I think that, when I was on the road with the book, someone would say, well, I work for a food justice organization, and we try to teach kids to like kale and how to cook this and how to that. And my question would always, I would ask people, do you talk to people about whether they have access to consistent electricity for refrigeration? Because telling someone to cook fresh food and then they can't afford their electric bill, it's not helpful. I'm from the Midwest. It's so cold in the winters that they won't cut off your gas so that you have heating. But the second they can, the utilities companies, they just do. So how are you cooking food? How much time are you spending working? Like, what is the kind of, what are the contexts in which we do all of these things? And so I think that was always my concern, to kind of contextualize how people make choices, but to also kind of break down these weird class-based analysis of like healthy versus not healthy. It's like this thing, like, a lot of my students eat a lot of Chipotle, and I feel like it's a generational thing. They really love Chipotle because they haven't had burritos in San Francisco. It's not their fault. And so they eat a lot of Chipotle, and the sterile environment in which you purchase this Chipotle makes you think it's like a whole and healthy food. It's like, it's a food. It's probably not the most nutritious food if we think about like calories and fat, but it's a food. But the ways that fast casual has demarcated itself as something that's okay for people who are educated to serve their kids, I think is really fascinating. All my friends who say my kids don't eat McDonald's, but they eat Panera. Panera is like a festival of sodium and sugar and carbohydrates. And it's a choice, right? But it's all of this type of framing I thought was really kind of fascinating. And that, that we are oriented to seek out fast food even when we're not eating fast food. It's my whole chicken fingers. Now that I have a child, my friends are like, there's going to be a stage where your kid's just going to consume dino nuggets, and that's that. And I think, okay, well, if they're organic dino nuggets from Whole Foods, am I a good mom? But why don't I just take them to McDonald's and like give them a big basket of chicken McNuggets? Like, what's the difference? It's these weird kind of ways that we attribute meaning to food. And I think that the racialization of fast food has then made it not just the food itself, but an inferior set of choices and lifestyles that we don't interrogate enough.
I wondered if you looked at, I mean, because it's just like this whole notion of food deserts, and I don't know if you ever got to this, but like, did supermarkets not get the same kinds of subsidies?
Did not. Supermarkets during this time were not qualified for the same type of small business assistance under the Office of Economic Opportunity. Also, the margins in supermarkets are really bad because you have all of this food that is like, the second it gets there, it starts degrading and has to be replaced. You know, fast food has a lot of shelf stable and frozen food that you can keep on hand. And so supermarkets were not part of this kind of rebuilding equation. And it really gave the fast food industry just a head start. We have one more question.
Okay, we got one more question from Elizabeth Woodbury. Unmute, Liz.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this this conversation, and I just had to pipe in anecdotally because I believe that I was working at McDonald's the summer that they first introduced salads and anything fresh, and that was the summer of 1987. I was working at McDonald's up in Burlington, Vermont, but I have to say there was possibly nothing healthy about I was the salad girl. That was the job that I would do at McDonald's. I said, I'll do it. I'll be the salad girl. It was like, I remember these bags of like 100 hard-boiled eggs. They would like, it was like a horror movie that were like in formaldehyde or something. And just that like terrible, terrible smelling lettuce. I mean, there was obviously nothing local about this salad. There was, no nutrition density. So, I mean, I have to say that these days, maybe it was like a 20 or 30 year sort of, curve before McDonald's arrived where it has today, which is actually not bad in my opinion. But those first few months of trying to introduce something fresh, where it was horrifying. So that's my anecdote.
You know, I have a newsletter on Substack where I write more about fast food and teaching and a number of things, but I talk about salad bars in the 80s and the real kind of challenges, because if you remember, Wendy's used to have a salad bar. Wendy's used to have a solarium and a salad bar, but soon after it was introduced, like it had things like chocolate pudding and like things that you could not lose so much overhead on. Oh, the Sizzler salad bar, yes. And so, salad bars would have like Jell-O salad, and it wasn't all like fruits and vegetables for this reason, right? This becomes a real like supply chain management bottom line issue. And the McDonald's salads never did very well because no one wanted to go to McDonald's and have a salad. Just like when they were experimenting with the lower calorie sandwiches, the McLean Deluxe. They had a series of sandwiches that were supposed to be for like adults that were a little bit more premium. These things don't take off as well as some of the kind of standards, because you were socialized usually into eating McDonald's with these standards. I probably spent too much time in the book, but it was too great not to talk about the failed experience that McDonald's had with something called a McBeef, the McBeef Deluxe. It was supposed to make you think you're eating steak at McDonald's, and onion nuggets that were supposed to like onion rings, and everyone gets gas from them and no one wants to eat them. And all of these kind of ideas that are not about the food or the food taste or the quality, it's about affect. And so when the last story I'll tell is, when the chicken sandwich gets rolled out, they do a test market with African Americans, and they're like, you said that this was chicken, it looks like a hamburger, but also there's no bone, there's no gravy, I don't get it. And so the analysis is, okay, you don't have to change the chicken sandwich, you have to make people feel special that you've made the chicken sandwich for them. And I think that this is, everything we need to know about the weird give and take between our kind of tastes and desires in the marketplace. And so with that, just, be discerning about which chicken sandwich you consume. The chicken sandwich wars of late have been really interesting to see that kind of product and the marketing of it as something that is either distinctly Southern or something that's African American. And the real challenge of food quality, to create this many, chicken breasts and this many brioche buns. I could talk about this all night, but on that note, I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you for those of you who read the book, and for those of you who haven't. I hope it sparks your interest or your curiosity, or speaks to something about your relationship with fast food.
Yeah, I'll just no one's paying me. I will just sell the book again. It's a fantastic book. So thank you.
Thank you, Brown community.
Yeah, thank you again for sharing your Sunday, doing more Zoom on Sunday. Thank you so much. And I just knew that because I have this Brown Book Club, John and Anne have been hosting us for years with Brown authors sometimes, and it's so great to actually have an actual Brown author to talk with and ask actual questions to. And I know that in our group, we read The Color of Law not too long ago. And to me, like, this is a book that goes just like side by side with that. And I would just love to see, next time I go to an AIA conference, I would love to see your book there along with The Color of Law, and
I would like to do the sales of Color of Law. That has been one of the most popular books about redlining, and it's such an important book, and people have really gravitated to it because it really just makes clear those origins. So it's a real compliment.
Well, that's what you talk about as well. It's just more hidden, that McDonald's, is a real estate business as well. So anyway, not to go into the weeds here, but thanks so much for sharing and your time, and stay well. And thank you, Brown community, again. Thank you, Julia. Stay well, everyone, and hope to see you in person sometime soon.
Thank you. Thanks for asking.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Well, Julia had.
Thank you.